The fog rolled in thick off the Willamette River that morning, wrapping Rose City Cemetery in a blanket of gray that felt almost suffocating. I stood under a black umbrella that did little to keep out the cold, watching as they lowered my mother's casket into the earth beside my father's grave. Catherine Hayes had been a force of nature, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and immediately make everyone feel seen. 6 months ago, we'd buried my father in this same spot. Now, as the minister's words drifted over the small gathering, I felt truly alone for the first time in my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria stood on the opposite side of the grave, her designer coat perfectly tailored, her makeup flawless despite the weather. My sister had always known how to present herself, how to be exactly what people expected. She dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, accepting condolences from business associates and society friends who'd come more out of obligation than genuine grief. When our eyes met across that open grave, she gave me a small practiced smile, the kind that looked warm in photographs but never quite reached the truth. I should have known then, should have recognized the satisfaction hiding behind that expression. But grief has a way of making you blind to what's right in front of you. I thought maybe, just maybe, losing both our parents within half a year might have softened something between us. That the years of competition and comparison might finally fall away, leaving just two sisters who'd survived the same loss. I was wrong. The rain had finally stopped by the time the last mourners left Riverside Manor. The old Victorian house sat perched in the West Hills, overlooking the city with views that stretched all the way to Mount Hood on clear days. Today, the mountains were hidden behind clouds, and the house felt darker than I remembered. Growing up here had been complicated. Beautiful rooms filled with beautiful things, but also filled with expectations that seemed to shift depending on which parent you were talking to. I found myself in the conservatory, a glass-walled room my mother had loved for its light. She'd kept her drafting table here, back before she'd given up her architecture dreams to help my father build Hayes Development Group into what it became. Sometimes I'd find her here late at night, sketching buildings that would never be built, designs that existed only in her imagination. The drafting table was still there, dust sheets covering it now, but I could picture her bent over it, pencil moving with sure, quick strokes. The attorney wants to see us tomorrow. Victoria's voice cut through my thoughts. She stood in the doorway, still in her funeral clothes, though she'd removed her coat. 10 o'clock at his office downtown. The will reading. I turned to face her. Both of us. That's what Daniel said. She checked her phone, already distracted. I have a meeting at 11:30, so hopefully it won't take long. These things are usually pretty straightforward. There was something in her tone, a confidence that made my stomach tighten. But I pushed the feeling aside. I'll be there. She nodded and disappeared back into the house, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. I stayed in the conservatory a while longer, watching the fog creep back in as evening approached. Through the glass, Portland's lights began to flicker on, thousands of tiny stars against the gathering dark. My phone buzzed. A text from Grace Mitchell, my mother's former assistant and one of her closest friends. Thinking of you today. Catherine was so proud of you. Never forget that. I stared at the message, feeling something crack in my chest. Grace had been there through everything, had watched my mother navigate the impossible balance of being Robert Hayes's wife, while trying to hold on to pieces of herself. If anyone understood what my mother had sacrificed, it was Grace. I drove back to my studio apartment in the Pearl District, as the city settled into its evening rhythm. The space was small, just one large room with high ceilings and exposed brick, but it was mine. I'd signed the lease 3 years ago when I'd finally saved enough from my work at Morrison Architecture to afford my own place. Victoria had laughed when she'd seen it, made some comment about bohemian phases and trust fund kids playing poor. She couldn't know that I'd paid for every square foot myself. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about tomorrow, about sitting in Daniel Pierce's office and hearing my mother's final wishes read aloud. Catherine had always been deliberate, thoughtful in everything she did. Whatever she'd decided about the estate, there would be reasons behind it. I just had to trust that. The offices of Pierce & Associates occupied the 10th floor of a building near Pioneer Courthouse Square. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the city, and the reception area was decorated with understated elegance. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in the same black suit I'd worn to the funeral. Victoria was already there, sitting in one of the leather chairs scrolling through her phone. "Emma." She looked up, giving me that same practiced smile. "Right on time." Daniel Pierce emerged from his office before I could respond. He was in his 50s, silver hair and kind eyes, the sort of person who inspired confidence just by being in the room. He'd handled my parents' legal affairs for over 20 years. "Girls," he said, though we were hardly girls anymore. "Come in, please." His office was exactly what you'd expect: wall of law books, mahogany desk, photos of his family arranged on the credenza. We sat in chairs facing his desk while he settled into his own seat, pulling a thick folder toward him. "First, let me say again how sorry I am for your loss. Catherine was an extraordinary woman." He paused, looking between us. "I've known you both since you were children. What I'm about to share was your mother's explicit wishes, drawn up and revised several times over the past 2 years. 2 years. My mother had been planning this for 2 years, long before my father's death." I felt Victoria shift in her chair beside me. Daniel opened the folder and began to read. The legal language washed over me at first, all the standard preamble about sound mind and legal authority. Then he got to the specific bequest. "To my daughter Victoria Hayes, I leave the entirety of Hayes Development Group, including all assets, properties, and financial holdings associated with the company. Additionally, I leave the family home known as Riverside Manor and all its contents, the vacation property in Cannon Beach, and the investment portfolio managed by Sterling Financial." I stopped breathing. Victoria sat very still beside me, but I could feel something radiating off her. Satisfaction, maybe. Or vindication. Daniel continued. "To my daughter Emma Hayes, I leave my personal effects, including my jewelry collection, my library, and my art supplies." That was it. Jewelry, books, and art supplies. While Victoria got millions in real estate, property, and investments, I got keepsakes. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to process what I was hearing. "There is one additional provision," Daniel said, and something in his voice made me look up. He was watching me carefully, and I saw something there. Not pity exactly, but understanding. Catherine established a community development trust, separate from the estate. The details of this trust are to be revealed to Emma Hayes only, at a separate meeting, 1 week from today. Victoria leaned forward. "What trust? I've never heard anything about a community development trust." "Your mother set it up privately 2 years ago. It doesn't affect the main estate distribution, which is why it's not detailed in this reading." Daniel's tone was professional but firm. "Emma, can you meet with me next Tuesday, same time?" I managed to nod, though my mind was reeling. "Yes, I'll be here." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Victoria signed papers, asked questions about transfer timelines and tax implications. She was already thinking ahead, already planning how to maximize what she'd received. I sat quietly, my mother's words echoing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In my head. Personal effects. As if 29 years of being her daughter could be summed up in jewelry and books. We left the office together, waiting for the elevator in silence. When the doors opened, Victoria finally spoke. "I know this might seem uneven," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "But Mom knew I was the one running the business, that I understood Dad's vision for the company. You have your architecture career. You never wanted to be part of Hayes Development anyway." The elevator descended, floor numbers ticking down. I watched them, counting each one, using them to keep my emotions in check. "She left you personal items because they meant something," Victoria continued. "Her jewelry collection alone is probably worth 6 figures. And that library? First editions, signed copies. You always loved books more than balance sheets anyway." We reached the ground floor. The doors opened onto the busy lobby, people moving with purpose toward their important meetings and significant lives. "You're right," I heard myself say. "I never wanted to be part of Dad's company." I walked away before she could respond, pushing through the revolving doors into the gray Portland morning. I made it 3 blocks before I had to stop, leaning against a brick wall, trying to breathe through the pressure in my chest. My phone rang. Grace. Emma? Honey, how did it go? I couldn't answer for a moment. When I finally found my voice, it came out steady despite everything. She left it all to Victoria. The company, the houses, everything. Silence on the other end. Then softly, oh sweetheart. There's something else though. Some kind of trust Daniel wants to tell me about next week. Something Mom set up separately. Catherine always had her reasons, Grace said carefully. Always. You know that about her. I thought I did. We talked for a few more minutes before I let her go. I stood on that street corner, watching the city move around me, and I thought about my mother. About the woman who'd sketched impossible buildings in the conservatory at night. About the envelope of cash that had appeared in my mailbox the week before graduate school tuition was due. No note, just enough to cover what my scholarships didn't. About the time she told me quietly that being true to yourself sometimes meant disappointing people who loved you. I took the bus back to my apartment. The Pearl District was busy with the lunch crowd, young professionals and artists mixing in the cafes and galleries that lined the streets. My building was a converted warehouse, all exposed beams and industrial charm. I climbed the stairs to the third floor and let myself into my small space. The afternoon light came through the tall windows, falling across my drafting table where I worked on freelance projects. I'd set it up in the same position my mother had kept hers in the conservatory, angled to catch the best light. It had been a gift from her, given to me when I graduated with my architecture degree. Every architect needs a proper workspace, she'd said, running her hand over the smooth surface. Even if you end up doing everything on computers now, there's something about drawing by hand. It connects you to the work differently. I sat at that table now, pulling out my mother's final gift to me. Personal effects. I thought about Victoria in Riverside Manor, walking through rooms that had belonged to our parents, claiming space that had been shaped by their choices and compromises. I thought about Hayes Development Group, the company my father had built on aggressive acquisitions and maximum profit margins, the company that had consumed so much of our family's energy. And I thought about my mother's conservatory, her secret sketches, the dreams she'd folded away. A week felt like a very long time. I spent those days going through the motions. Work continued at Morrison Architecture, where I was part of a team designing a new mixed-use development in Southeast Portland. My boss, Richard Morrison, was a mentor in his own way, someone who valued creativity and community impact over pure profit. He'd known my mother slightly, had spoken at a panel with her years ago about sustainable urban development. Take the time you need, he told me when I'd explained about the funeral. Family comes first. But work was a relief, honestly. It gave me something to focus on besides the growing knot of confusion and hurt in my chest. I threw myself into the project, refining designs, researching materials, attending meetings with city planners. Victoria called twice. The first time to ask about scheduling a time to go through Mom's personal items at the house. The second to inform me she was putting the Cannon Beach property on the market. It just makes sense, she said. Neither of us uses it, and the market's strong right now. We can split whatever it sells for. The will left it to you, I reminded her. You don't need my permission. I'm trying to be fair, Emma. Her voice carried an edge of impatience. You're acting like I did something wrong. I didn't answer that. After a moment, she sighed. Look, I know you're upset, but this is what Mom wanted. She knew I could handle the responsibility of the estate. You've always been the creative one, the dreamer. There's nothing wrong with that. We're just different. Different. As if that explained everything. As if our parents hadn't spent our entire childhood holding us up against each other, measuring and comparing. Victoria got praised for her business sense, her practical thinking, her ability to network and negotiate. I got told I was too sensitive, too idealistic, too much in my own head. My father especially had made it clear that my chosen path was essentially a hobby, something I'd eventually outgrow when I got serious about life. Only my mother had understood. Or so I'd thought. Tuesday morning arrived cold and clear. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy suit that made me feel more confident than I felt. The bus downtown was crowded with commuters, everyone absorbed in their phones or staring out windows. I watched the city slide past, the bridges over the Willamette, The new construction mixing with historic buildings, the constant evolution that made Portland feel both permanent and temporary at once. Daniel Pierce's secretary showed me straight into his office. He was waiting, that same kind expression on his face, but there was something else now too. Purpose, maybe. He gestured to the chair I'd sat in a week ago. Emma, thank you for coming. He didn't waste time with small talk. What I'm about to share with you is something your mother planned very carefully. She made me promise not to reveal any of this until after the main will had been read and Victoria had taken possession of the primary estate. He slid a document across the desk. I picked it up, scanning the legal language. Words jumped out at me. Trust. Beneficiary. Conditions. My hand started shaking. 2 years ago, your mother came to me with a plan, Daniel said quietly. She'd been diagnosed with a heart condition. The doctors gave her 5 to 10 years, possibly more with treatment, but she wanted to be prepared. She asked me to help her set up something separate from your father's estate, something he wouldn't know about. Why? My voice came out hoarse. Because she knew how the main estate would be divided. Your father had very specific ideas about succession, about who should inherit Hayes' development. Catherine didn't agree with all of his choices, but she also knew that fighting him on it would cause a rift that might never heal. So she found another way. He pulled out another folder, this one thicker. Your mother had resources your father didn't know about. An inheritance from her own parents that she'd kept separate, some investments she'd made independently. Over the years, she'd built up a considerable fund. Not as large as the main estate, but significant. She put all of it into this trust. My heart was pounding. Daniel opened the folder and showed me a summary sheet. The number at the bottom made my vision blur. $8 million. I stared at the number, convinced I was misreading it. $8 million. My mother had $8 million that nobody knew about, that she'd hidden away and put into a trust with my name on it. The office suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. How? I managed to ask. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Your mother was smarter than most people gave her credit for. When her parents died, they left her a substantial inheritance. Your father was already successful by then, so Catherine invested her inheritance separately. She was quite good at it, actually. She had a talent for identifying undervalued properties in neighborhoods that were about to turn around. She'd buy, hold for a few years, then sell. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. Just steady, intelligent investing. He pulled out another document, this one showing a list of properties. I recognized some of the addresses, buildings and neighborhoods that had transformed over the past 2 decades. The Alberta Arts District, Mississippi Avenue, parts of Division Street before they'd become trendy. My mother had owned pieces of Portland's transformation. She also inherited her parents' stock portfolio, Daniel continued. Tech stocks, mostly purchased back in the 90s when nobody knew what the internet would become. She held on to them through the crashes, through the recoveries. By the time she came to me 2 years ago, her separate assets had grown to just over $9 million. She used $1 million to establish a foundation for affordable housing advocacy. The rest went into this trust. I couldn't process it. All those years watching my father dominate every financial decision, every business move, thinking my mother had given up her independence. And all along, she'd been building something of her own. Why didn't she tell me? She wanted to, Daniel said gently. But she also wanted to wait until the right time. She knew your father's will would favor Victoria. Robert was very traditional in his thinking about succession, about who should run the family business. Catherine understood that fighting him on it would only create division, so she made her own plan. He pushed the thick folder toward me. This trust comes with conditions, Emma. Your mother didn't just want to give you money. She wanted to give you purpose. I opened the folder, my hands still trembling. Inside were architectural drawings, old ones, rendered in my mother's distinctive style. A waterfront development, multiple buildings, mixed-use spaces. The detail was extraordinary, every window and doorway carefully considered, every sight line thoughtfully planned. These weren't rough sketches. These were complete designs, the kind that took months of work. She drew these. I asked, though I already knew the answer. I'd recognize my mother's line work anywhere. Over the course of 15 years, Daniel said. She kept coming back to this project, refining it, updating it as her vision evolved. She called it her legacy project. The thing she would have built if she'd stayed an architect instead of becoming Robert Hayes's wife. I turned the pages slowly, taking in the scope of what my mother had imagined. This wasn't just a building. It was a community. Affordable housing mixed with commercial spaces for local businesses. Artist studios with subsidized rent. A community center with classrooms and gathering spaces. Green roofs and courtyards designed to bring people together. It was ambitious and idealistic and absolutely beautiful. The trust is structured around this project, Daniel explained. The $8 million is designated for the purchase and development of the property your mother identified for this build. The old Morrison warehouse complex, down by the waterfront. I looked up sharply. The Morrison complex is huge. Those buildings have been empty for years. 20 years, actually. The owner is a real estate investment group that's been sitting on it, waiting for the right offer. Your mother had been in quiet negotiations with them for the past 18 months. She made them an offer contingent on certain conditions being met. They accepted, pending final approval from the estate. He slid another document toward me. A purchase agreement, signed by my mother 3 months before her death. The price was fair, well below what the property could command in the current market. In exchange, the agreement specified that the development must include 40% affordable housing. Units in that 30% of the commercial spaces must be leased to local businesses at below market rates. Your mother secured this deal, Daniel said. But she couldn't complete it in her lifetime. The conditions of the trust state that you must execute this project. You must see her designs become reality. The weight of it settled over me. My mother hadn't just left me money. She'd left me her dreams, her unrealized ambitions, everything she wanted to create but never could. And she'd given me the means to make it happen. What if I can't? The words came out small, almost childlike. I'm just an associate at a firm. I've never managed a project this size. I've never even been a lead architect on anything major. Your mother believed you could, Daniel said simply. She spent 2 years setting this up, making sure every piece was in place. She chose you specifically because she knew you understood what she was trying to create. Not just buildings, Emma. Community. Connection. The things your father's company never cared about. I looked back at the drawings, seeing them differently now. This was my mother's voice, speaking through lines and spaces, telling me what mattered to her. All those nights in the conservatory, sketching buildings that would never be built, she'd been working toward this. Preparing for a future where someone would carry her vision forward. There's one more condition, Daniel said, and something in his tone made me look up. The trust specifically states that you cannot accept any financial assistance from Hayes Development Group or from Victoria Hayes personally. Your mother wanted this project to be completely independent from your father's legacy. If you take any money or resources from the family business, the trust dissolves and the funds revert to the Affordable Housing Foundation she established. She really thought of everything, I murmured. She had 2 years, Daniel reminded me. And she was very determined. She also left you this. He handed me an envelope, smaller than the others, with my name written in my mother's handwriting across the front. I held it for a moment, not ready to open it, not ready to hear her voice again. Take your time, Daniel said. I'll step out for a few minutes, let you read it in private. He left, closing the door quietly behind him. I sat alone in his office, holding my mother's final words, surrounded by architectural drawings and legal documents that represented a secret life I'd never known about. Outside the window, Portland continued its daily rhythm, unaware that my entire understanding of my family had just been rewritten. I opened the envelope carefully, pulling out 2 sheets of paper covered in my mother's neat handwriting. The date at the top was from 3 months ago, shortly before her death. My dearest Emma, it began. If you're reading this, then Daniel has shown you the trust and you know about the Morrison project. I imagine you're feeling overwhelmed right now, possibly angry that I kept this from you. Let me try to explain. I could hear her voice in the words, that calm, measured tone she used when she had something important to say. When I married your father, I thought I could have both. A marriage and a career. A family and my own identity. But Robert needed someone to help him build Hayes Development. And I convinced myself that helping him achieve his dreams was the same as achieving my own. For a long time I believed that. I put away my drafting pencils and learned to read balance sheets. I attended business dinners and smiled for photographs. I became the wife he needed me to be. The next paragraph was harder to read, the handwriting a little less steady. But something happens when you spend years putting your dreams aside. They don't disappear. They just move deeper, becoming a constant ache you learn to ignore. I would see a vacant lot and imagine what could be built there. I'd walk through the city and notice all the empty spaces, the missed opportunities, the ways we fail to create community in our obsession with profit. And I'd come home to our beautiful house in the West Hills and feel like I was living someone else's life. I had to pause, wiping my eyes. I'd never known. All those years I'd seen my mother as content, as someone who'd made her choices and lived with them peacefully. I'd never guessed at the cost. When you told me you wanted to study architecture, I felt something wake up inside me. Hope maybe. Or recognition. I saw myself in you, Emma, the version of myself I'd buried. And I was determined that you would have the chance I never took. So I started saving, investing, building a fund that could support you if you needed it. But the more I saved, the more I realized I wanted something bigger. I wanted to show you that dreams deferred aren't dreams destroyed. They're just waiting for the right moment, the right person to bring them to life. The letter went on, explaining how she'd started working on the Morrison project designs, how she'd spent hours researching sustainable building practices and community development models, how she'd driven by that abandoned warehouse complex dozens of times, imagining what it could become. I know this is a huge responsibility to place on you, she wrote. Believe me, I've questioned this decision many times. But I also know you, Emma. I know your talent, your vision, your commitment to creating spaces that matter. You understand that architecture isn't just about buildings. It's about the people who inhabit them, the communities they serve, the lives they shape. Your father never understood that. Hayes Development has always been about maximizing returns, never about maximizing impact. She addressed Victoria next, and I felt my chest tighten. I love your sister, but she is her father's daughter in ways that go beyond business sense. She sees property as assets, not as potential. She'll do well with Hayes Development, will probably make it even more profitable than it is now. That's her gift. But this project needs someone different. It needs someone who understands what I was trying to say with these designs. It needs you. The final paragraph was the hardest to read. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you about this in person. I wanted to so many times. But I also knew that if I told you before I died, you might try to talk me out of it, might insist I pursue this project myself. And the truth is, I'm too tired, Emma. I've spent too many years being someone else. But you're just beginning. You have the energy and the courage I lost along the way. Build this for me. Build it for yourself. Build it for everyone who needs to see that there's another way to develop a city, another way to think about what we leave behind. Show them what's possible when profit isn't the only measure of success. She'd signed it simply, with all my love and all my faith, Mom. I sat there for a long time, the letter in my lap, tears running down my face. Daniel eventually knocked softly and came back in, not saying anything, just sitting down and waiting while I collected myself. She knew, I finally said. She knew what it would feel like to sit in here last week and hear that Victoria got everything. She knew how that would hurt. She did, Daniel confirmed. She hated it, actually. But she also knew that revealing the trust at the same time would undermine its purpose. She wanted you to feel the full weight of that moment, to understand exactly how your father saw you, how the world would see you if you let other people's valuations define you. And then she wanted you to discover that she saw something completely different. I looked at the drawings again, spread across Daniel's desk. My mother's life work, her secret ambition, now mine to execute or fail at. What happens if I can't pull this off? I asked. What if the project fails? Then the trust has provisions for that too, Daniel said. If the project becomes financially unviable, the remaining funds go to the Affordable Housing Foundation. You won't lose anything you didn't already have. But Emma, your mother didn't choose you because she thought you might succeed. She chose you because she was certain you would. That's a lot of faith. That's a mother's love, he replied. Now there's a lot of paperwork to sign if you want to move forward. The purchase agreement needs to be finalized within 30 days, and you'll need to establish yourself as the trust administrator. There are also some preliminary conversations you should have with city planning and the Historical Society, since the Morrison buildings have landmark status. The practical steps helped ground me. This wasn't just an emotional inheritance. It was a real project with real deadlines and real requirements. I could work with that. I understood how to take something overwhelming and break it down into manageable pieces. I'll need to tell my boss, I said, thinking out loud. Richard will need to know I'm taking this on. And I'll probably need to take a leave of absence from the firm. Your mother anticipated that, Daniel said, pulling out yet another document. The trust includes a living stipend for you during the project timeline. It's not extravagant, but it's enough to cover your expenses for up to 3 years. She didn't want you to have to choose between pursuing this and keeping a roof over your head. 3 years. My mother had given me 3 years to make her dreams real. 3 years to prove that her faith in me wasn't misplaced. 3 years to build something that would stand as a testament to what she'd valued, what she'd believed possible. There's one more thing you should know, Daniel said carefully. Victoria doesn't know about any of this. Obviously she knows you had a separate meeting with me, but she doesn't know the details. Your mother was very clear that the trust is your business and yours alone. You're not required to tell Victoria anything. In fact, given the conditions about not accepting help from Hayes Development, it might be simpler to keep this private for now. I thought about my sister, about her perfectly styled confidence last week as she'd inherited an empire, about her casual dismissal of my hurt, her assumption that books and jewelry were appropriate compensation for being valued less. Part of me wanted to call her right now, wanted to see her face when she learned that our mother had left me something far more valuable than real estate holdings. But another part of me, the part that was starting to understand my mother's strategy, knew that Daniel was right. This needed to stay separate. The moment Victoria knew about the trust, she tried to involve Hayes Development, try to turn it into a family project or a business opportunity. And then I'd have to refuse, and the distance between us would become permanent. I won't tell her, I decided. Not yet. Not until the project is further along. Daniel nodded approvingly. Wise choice. Now let's talk about next steps. We spent the next 2 hours going through paperwork. I signed forms establishing myself as the trust administrator, documents authorizing the property purchase, disclosures required by the city. My hand cramped from all the signatures, but I kept going, each one feeling like a commitment, a promise to my mother that I wouldn't let her down. By the time I left Daniel's office, it was past noon. I walked out into downtown Portland, the lunch crowd filling the food carts and cafes around Pioneer Square. The city looked different now, charged with possibility. I kept seeing potential everywhere. Empty lots that could become something meaningful, old buildings that could be reimagined, spaces that could bring people together instead of pushing them apart. I found myself walking toward the waterfront, following the route I traced on the property maps in Daniel's office. The Morrison warehouse complex sat on 3 acres along the Willamette River, 5 connected buildings that had once housed a shipping and distribution operation. The buildings had been empty since the company went bankrupt 2 decades ago, victims of changing shipping patterns and a poorly timed expansion. Various developers had looked at the property over the years, but the landmark status and the cost of renovation had scared most of them off. They'd wanted to tear everything down and start fresh, but the Historical Society wouldn't allow it. So the buildings sat, windows broken, walls covered in graffiti, slowly deteriorating while the city grew around them. I stood across the street, looking at what my mother had seen. Not decay but possibility. Not a problem but an opportunity. The buildings had good bones, solid brick construction from an era when things were built to last. The location was perfect, close enough to downtown, but on the edge of a neighborhood that was just starting to revitalize. And the river access, that was something special. Imagine living or working steps from the water, having that constant reminder of movement and change. My phone rang. Grace. How did it go? She asked. With the attorney? I realized Grace probably knew. She'd been my mother's closest friend, her confidant. There was no way my mother had planned all this without talking to someone about it. You knew, I said. About the trust. A pause. Catherine swore me to secrecy. I wanted to tell you, especially after the will reading last week. Killed me to think of you hurting like that. But she made me promise to let Daniel handle it, to let you discover it the way she'd planned. She left me $8 million and a massive development project, I said, still not quite believing it myself. She wants me to build the Morrison complex. I know. She showed me the drawings. They're beautiful, Emma. It's going to be incredible. If I don't completely screw it up. You won't, Grace said firmly. Your mother wouldn't have chosen you if she had any doubts. She knew exactly what you were capable of, even if you don't yet. We talked for a while longer. Grace filling in details about my mother's planning process, how excited Catherine had been as the pieces came together. Apparently my mother had visited the Morrison site dozens of times, taking photographs, making notes, refining her vision. She'd even met with some of the community members who lived nearby, asking them what they needed, what was missing from the neighborhood. She did all that without anyone knowing? I asked. Your mother was good at keeping secrets when she needed to, Grace said. She'd learned that living with your father. Robert didn't like being questioned or challenged. So Catherine learned to work around him, to pursue her interests quietly. It wasn't ideal, but it was survival. After we hung up, I continued to stare at the warehouse buildings. I could see my mother here, camera in hand, notebook open, sketching possibilities. All those years I'd thought she'd given up on her dreams. She'd actually been here, planning, preparing, building toward this moment. My phone buzzed again. A text from Victoria. Need to schedule time for you to collect Mom's personal items. This weekend. I looked at the message, then back at the warehouses. Personal items. Jewelry and books and art supplies. The scraps Victoria thought were appropriate for the daughter who didn't fit the family business model. She had no idea what our mother had really left me. No idea that while she was learning to maximize profit margins, I was being chosen to carry forward something that actually mattered. I typed back, "This weekend works." Then I opened my camera and started taking photographs of the Morrison buildings, just like my mother had done. I needed to document everything, needed to start seeing the property not as it was, but as it could be. I walked the perimeter, noting the condition of the different structures, thinking about which spaces would work for residential units, which ones made sense for commercial use. My architects, I automatically started measuring, calculating, planning. A homeless man sat near one of the building entrances, his belongings in a shopping cart beside him. He watched me photograph the buildings, then called out, "You another developer? They've been sniffing around here for years. Never do nothing." I walked over to him. "What would you want to see here? If someone did develop it?" He looked surprised by the question. "Me? I don't want nothing. Just somewhere warm and dry. Not that I could afford whatever they build. What if some of it was affordable? What if there were units people could actually live in without paying half their income?" He laughed, but it wasn't unkind. "Lady, nobody builds affordable housing right on the waterfront. Not in this city. That's prime real estate. That's for rich people." "Maybe it doesn't have to be," I said. He studied me more carefully. "You're serious?" "I'm serious." "Then you're either crazy or you're some kind of saint. Either way, good luck. This city needs more crazy saints." I thought about that as I walked back toward the bus stop. Crazy or a saint? My mother had been called worse things for her idealism, but she'd also been right about so much. Right that there was another way to think about development, another metric beyond profit. Right that someone needed to prove it was possible. My phone rang as I waited for the bus. Richard Morrison, my boss. "Emma, how are you holding up? I know this has been a difficult couple of weeks." "I'm okay," I said. "Actually, I need to talk to you about something. Would you have time this week?" "Of course. Tomorrow morning? Coffee before the office?" We agreed on a time and place. I'd need to tell him about the project, about taking a leave of absence. Richard would understand, or at least I hoped he would. His firm valued community-focused design. This project aligned with everything he'd taught me about architecture that served people rather than just serving developers. The bus arrived and I found a seat near the window. As we crossed the Burnside Bridge, I looked back at the waterfront, at the Morrison buildings growing smaller in the distance. Somewhere in those decaying structures was my mother's dream, waiting to be realized. Somewhere in those empty spaces was the proof that she'd never really given up, that she'd just been playing the long game. And now it was my turn. I met Richard Morrison at a small coffee shop in the Alberta Arts District, one of those places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. He was already there when I arrived, 2 cups of coffee on the table between us. Richard had always been perceptive that way, anticipating what people needed before they asked. "You look different," he said as I sat down. "More focused, maybe. Or more determined." I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, gathering my thoughts. My mother left me something. Not what everyone thinks she left me. Something else entirely. I told him about the trust, about the $8 million in the Morrison warehouse complex, about my mother's secret architectural practice, the drawings she'd been refining for 15 years, the vision she'd never been able to execute herself. Richard listened without interrupting, his expression growing more interested with each detail. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. Catherine Hayes was planning a major waterfront development project, and nobody knew about it. That's remarkable. And she chose you to execute it. "I've never led a project this size," I said, voicing the fear that had kept me awake most of the night. "I've been an associate for 3 years. I've worked on designs, sure, but I've never been the architect of record. I've never managed contractors or navigated city approval processes or dealt with budgets this large. What if I'm not ready?" "Emma, look at me." Richard's tone was firm but kind. "Nobody is ever ready for their first major project. Readiness isn't something that happens before you start. It's something you develop by doing the work. Your mother understood that. She gave you not just the resources but the challenge. She believed you could grow into this." "I need to take a leave of absence," I said. "I can't do this project and work here. It wouldn't be fair to you or to the firm." I figured as much. He took a sip of his coffee. "And I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you. I don't want you to take a leave of absence. I want you to partner with us." I stared at him. "What?" "Morrison Architecture specializes in exactly this kind of work. Community-focused development, sustainable design, projects that balance economic viability with social impact. This Morrison project is everything we talk about wanting to do. Let us be your architecture firm of record. You lead the design, you make the decisions, but you have our infrastructure behind you. Our engineers, our project managers, our relationships with contractors and city officials. You get the support you need and we get to be part of something meaningful. The trust has conditions," I said slowly. "I can't accept help from my family's company. Everything has to be independent." "We're not your family's company," Richard pointed out. "We're a separate firm with our own reputation and values. Your mother knew about us, didn't she? She knew we'd worked together on community projects before. I'd bet she was counting on you reaching out for professional support from people who understood what she was trying to do." I thought about my mother's careful planning, how she'd anticipated so many scenarios. Of course she would have thought about this. Of course she would have known I'd need experienced partners to pull something this ambitious off. What would the arrangement look like? I asked. "You maintain full creative control and decision-making authority. We provide technical support, project management, and our firm's credentials for city approvals. We'd structure it as a collaboration with you as the principal architect on record. Our fee would be reasonable, probably 20% below our normal rate because frankly, Emma, this is the kind of project every architect dreams of working on. This is legacy work." Legacy work. That's exactly what my mother had called it in her letter. I felt something settle in my chest, a sense of rightness that cut through the anxiety. "I need to think about it," I said. "Review the trust documents. Make sure this doesn't violate any conditions." "Of course. Talk to your attorney. Take whatever time you need. But Emma, don't let fear make this decision. Your mother didn't give you an easy path because easy paths don't prove anything. She gave you something challenging because she knew you were capable of rising to it." We talked for another hour about the specifics of the project. Richard asked to see my mother's drawings, and I promised to bring them by the office once I'd had them properly scanned and backed up. He shared some thoughts about the Morrison buildings based on his knowledge of the area, mentioned some potential pitfalls with the landmark status, and some opportunities with current city incentives for affordable housing development. By the time we parted ways, I felt less alone in this. My mother had set me up with resources and a vision, but she'd also positioned me to find the help I'd need. Richard's offer wasn't charity. It was a genuine professional collaboration that could benefit everyone involved. And more importantly, it aligned with what my mother had been trying to do, building something through partnership rather than dominance, through shared values rather than pure profit motivation. I spent the rest of that week diving into research. I contacted Daniel Pierce to review the trust conditions and confirm that partnering with Morrison Architecture wouldn't violate the independence requirements. He agreed it was permissible since Richard's firm had no connection to Hayes Development Group, and the collaboration would be arm's length and professional. I also started reaching out to community organizations in the neighborhood around the Morrison complex. My mother's notes included contact information for several people she'd spoken with, local activists and neighborhood association leaders who'd been part of her informal research process. They were surprised to hear from me. Even more surprised to learn that Catherine's project was actually moving forward. One of them, a woman named Patricia Chun who ran a community center 3 blocks from the Morrison site, invited me to attend their next neighborhood meeting. "Your mother came to several of our meetings," Patricia told me over the phone. She didn't announce who she was or what she was planning. She just sat and listened, asked good questions. People appreciated that. Most developers never bother to ask what the community actually needs. The meeting was held in a church basement on Thursday evening. About 30 people showed up, a mix of longtime residents and newer arrivals, business owners and renters, young families and elderly neighbors. Patricia introduced me, explaining that I was Catherine Hayes's daughter, and that I was taking over the Morrison project. The reaction was mixed. Some people looked hopeful, excited that the abandoned buildings might finally become something useful. Others were skeptical, having seen too many promises from developers who talked about community benefit, but delivered luxury condos and chain stores. An older man named Gerald stood up. "What are you really planning to build? And don't give us the sales pitch. We've heard plenty of those. Tell us the truth." I had brought copies of my mother's drawings, reduced and printed on regular paper. I passed them around the room. My mother spent 15 years designing this project. She didn't do it to maximize profit. She did it because she believed development could serve a community instead of displacing it. 40% of the residential units will be affordable housing, priced for people making 50 to 80% of area median income. The commercial spaces will prioritize local businesses over chains, with below-market lease rates for the first 3 years. There will be a community center with free programming, artist studios, and public gathering spaces along the river. A younger woman named Keisha raised her hand. "That sounds great, but we've heard promises before. How do we know you'll actually follow through? How do we know this won't just be another gentrification project dressed up in pretty language?" It was a fair question. I thought about how my mother would have answered it, how she would have earned their trust. "You don't know," I said honestly. "You have no reason to trust me yet. But here's what I'm proposing. I want to form a community advisory board. Real people from this neighborhood who will review plans, provide input, and hold me accountable. I want you involved in the design process, in the tenant selection for commercial spaces, in the programming for the community center. This won't be something I do to your neighborhood. It'll be something we do together." Patricia looked impressed. "That's a significant commitment. Advisory boards take time, and they complicate decision-making." "Good decisions should be complicated," I replied. "Easy decisions are usually the ones that only serve one group of people. I want this to work for everyone." We spent the next 2 hours talking through details. People had questions about timeline, about construction impacts, about parking and traffic. They had concerns about existing residents being priced out as the neighborhood improved. They wanted guarantees about hiring local contractors and workers. I took notes on everything, promising to address each concern in the project plans. By the end of the meeting, the mood had shifted. People weren't completely convinced, but they were willing to give me a chance. Gerald, the skeptical, older man, approached me as people were leaving. "Your mother came to these meetings for almost 2 years. He said. "She never made promises she couldn't keep. Never oversold what she was doing. If you're really her daughter, you'll do the same." "I'll try," I said. "Don't try," he replied. "Do." This neighborhood doesn't need another person who tries. It needs someone who does. I drove home that night thinking about the weight of what I'd committed to. It would have been easier to work with the community as an afterthought, to make decisions and then present them as done deals. But that's what Hayes Development did, what my father had built his empire on. This needed to be different. My mother had understood that genuine community development meant actually including the community, even when it was messy and slow. Saturday arrived too quickly. I'd been dreading it all week, the prospect of going back to Riverside Manor to collect my mother's personal items. Victoria had texted precise instructions about when to arrive and which entrance to use, as if I were a visitor rather than someone who'd grown up in that house. I pulled up to the estate just before 10 in the morning. The gardens looked immaculate, probably the work of the landscaping crew my parents had employed for decades. Everything about the property spoke of wealth and careful maintenance, the kind of place that required constant attention to maintain its perfection. Victoria answered the door herself, dressed casually in expensive athleisure wear. "Emma." Right on time. She stepped aside to let me in. "I've had everything moved to the library. It seemed easier than having you wander through the whole house." The dismissal in her tone was subtle but clear. This wasn't my house anymore. I was here to collect my things and leave. I followed her down the familiar hallway, past rooms I'd known my entire life, now feeling like they belonged to a stranger. The library was exactly as I remembered it, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather furniture, and the large window overlooking the gardens. But now there were boxes stacked near the fireplace, my mother's belongings reduced to containers waiting to be hauled away. "I had Margaret pack everything up," Victoria said, gesturing to the boxes. "The jewelry is in the smaller cases. The books are in the larger ones. There were quite a few art supplies in the conservatory, those are in the boxes marked studio. I think that's everything specified in the will." I approached the boxes slowly, not quite ready to start going through them. "What are you doing with the rest of the house?" "I'm redecorating," Victoria said. "Most of the furniture is too old-fashioned. I want something more contemporary. I'm thinking of converting Mom's conservatory into a home gym. The light is perfect for it." Something twisted in my chest. The conservatory, where my mother had spent so many hours dreaming and planning, reduced to a home gym because the light was good. "I see. Don't look at me like that," Victoria said, her tone sharpening. "She left the house to me, Emma. That means I get to decide what to do with it. You can't expect me to keep everything exactly as it was, like some kind of shrine." I didn't say anything. "You didn't have to." She crossed her arms. "You've been judging me since the will reading, acting like I did something wrong by inheriting the estate. Mom made her choices. It's not my fault she valued my contributions more than yours." I turned to face her fully. "Is that really what you think? That she valued you more? What else am I supposed to think? She left me everything. The company, the properties, the investments. You got some jewelry and books. The math is pretty clear." I almost told her then. Almost revealed the trust, the $8 million, the Morrison project. But I stopped myself. This wasn't about winning an argument with Victoria. This was about honoring my mother's strategy, keeping the two legacies separate. "You're right," I said instead. "Mom made her choices." Victoria looked slightly taken aback, as if she'd expected more of a fight. "Well, good. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. Can I have some time alone with the boxes? I'd like to go through them by myself." She checked her watch. "I have a yoga class at noon. Will an hour be enough?" "That's fine." Victoria left, her footsteps fading down the hallway. I heard the distant sound of a door closing, then silence. I was alone in the library with my mother's things, the sum total of what Victoria believed was my entire inheritance. I started with the jewelry boxes. My mother hadn't been flashy, but she'd had some beautiful pieces. Her engagement ring, which my father had given her when he'd proposed. A pearl necklace that had belonged to her own mother. Earrings and bracelets accumulated over decades of birthdays and anniversaries. I picked up each piece slowly, remembering when I'd seen her wear them, what occasions had been marked by these small treasures. The books were harder. My mother had been a voracious reader, everything from architecture journals to literary fiction to history and philosophy. She'd written notes in the margins of many of them, observations and reactions that gave me glimpses into her thoughts. In one book about sustainable urban design, she'd underlined a passage about the responsibility of architects to serve not just clients but communities. In the margin she'd written, "This is what I should have done. What I still might do." Even then she'd been planning. Even years ago, she'd been holding on to the possibility that she might reclaim her architectural dreams. The art supplies were extensive. High-quality drafting pencils, professional grade markers, expensive paper that she'd been saving for projects that mattered. There were also notebooks, dozens of them, filled with sketches and calculations and notes. I opened one and immediately recognized the Morrison project in its early stages. Rough floor plans, elevation studies, notes about light angles and traffic flow. I sat on the library floor surrounded by boxes and went through notebook after notebook. This was my mother's secret life, documented in careful detail. She'd been working on the Morrison designs for at least 15 years, just as Daniel had said. I could see the evolution of her thinking, how the project had grown more sophisticated over time, how she'd refined her vision with each iteration. In one of the later notebooks, I found notes from her meetings with community members. Names and quotes, observations about what people said they needed. Gerald worried about displacement. Wants guarantees for existing residents. He's right to worry. Patricia suggests community space for youth programs. Kids need safe places after school. Keisha asks who this development is really for. Valid question. Must ensure answer is everyone. My mother hadn't just designed buildings. She designed relationships, connections, a vision of how different people with different needs could coexist in the same space. This was architecture as social engineering in the best possible sense, using design to solve human problems. I found my phone and started photographing pages, documenting my mother's process. This was research I'd need for the actual development work, but it was also something more. It was proof of who my mother had really been, beyond the role she'd played as Robert Hayes's wife. Near the bottom of one box I found a smaller notebook, different from the others. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. I opened it carefully and realized I was looking at my mother's journal from college, from her years studying architecture before she'd met my father. The entries were full of enthusiasm and ambition. She wrote about professors who challenged her, about designs that excited her, about her dreams of starting her own firm someday. She wrote about wanting to create buildings that mattered, spaces that could change how people lived and connected with each other. Reading it felt like meeting a version of my mother I'd never known, young and unburdened by the compromises she hadn't yet made. Then the entries shifted. She met Robert Hayes at a fundraiser. He was charming, successful, confident. He pursued her intensely, and she was flattered by his attention. The early entries about him were full of excitement. He was sophisticated, worldly, everything she thought she wanted. But gradually the tone changed. He started suggesting she didn't need to work so hard on her thesis project, that she was stressing herself unnecessarily. He talked about how busy he was building his company, how nice it would be to have a partner who could support him. The word partner appeared a lot in these entries, but the meaning kept shifting. At first, my mother seemed to think it meant equals working together. Later, it became clear Robert meant something else entirely. The final entry in the journal was dated a week before her wedding. "I'm choosing Robert," she wrote. "Choosing the life he's offering. Is it what I imagined for myself? No. But maybe it's better. Maybe practical happiness is more sustainable than ambitious dreams. Maybe I can find fulfillment in supporting someone else's vision instead of constantly fighting for my own. I'm putting this notebook away. That version of me, the one who thought she could change the world with buildings, she's young and naive. Time to grow up." I closed the notebook, my hands shaking. My mother had known. Even before the wedding, she'd known she was giving something up, making a trade. And she'd convinced herself it was the mature choice, the reasonable decision. For 30 years she'd lived with that choice. And then finally she'd found a way to undo it. The Morrison project wasn't just about buildings. It was about reclaiming the dreams she'd set aside. It was about proving to herself that the young woman who'd wanted to change the world wasn't naive. She was just early. I packed everything carefully back into the boxes. Victoria's hour was almost up, and I needed to get these things to my apartment. But first, I took one last walk through Riverside Manor. I went to the conservatory, the room my sister planned to convert into a gym. The drafting table was still there. Dust sheets removed but the surface bare. My mother's chair sat empty, angled toward the windows overlooking the city. I could see her so clearly in this space, bent over her drawings, creating a secret future. "I'll finish it," I said out loud to the empty room. "I promise." Victoria found me there a few minutes later. "Ready to load up your car?" "Yes. Thank you for packing everything." We carried the boxes out together, loading them into my small sedan. It took several trips and we worked in silence. When the last box was secured, Victoria stood back, brushing dust off her hands. "Listen, Emma. I know things have been weird between us, and I know you probably think I'm cold or greedy or whatever, but I'm just trying to do what's best for the family business. Dad built something important, and now it's my responsibility to carry it forward. That's not something you ever wanted, so it made sense for Mom to leave it to me." I looked at my sister, really looked at her. She believed what she was saying. She genuinely thought our mother's choices had been about business qualifications, about who was best suited to run Hayes Development. It hadn't occurred to her that maybe our mother had been thinking about something deeper, something more important than profit margins and property portfolios. "You're right," I said. "I never wanted to run Dad's company. I wanted something different." "And that's fine," Victoria said, her tone conciliatory now that she'd said her piece. "You're talented, Emma. You'll do well at Morrison's firm. Maybe eventually you'll make partner there. Build your own career, separate from the family." "Maybe," I agreed. I drove away from Riverside Manor with my mother's belongings packed into every available space in my car. In my rearview mirror, I watched the house shrink, that perfect estate that represented everything my father had valued. Victoria could have it. She could redecorate it, modernize it, turn it into whatever she wanted. It didn't matter. My inheritance was in the boxes surrounding me, in the notebooks filled with dreams and plans, in the trust Daniel Pierce had revealed, in the warehouse buildings waiting to be transformed. My inheritance was the permission to be ambitious, to value impact over income, to believe that architecture could change lives. That evening, I spread my mother's drawings across my apartment floor, studying them with fresh eyes. I'd looked at them before, but now I understood their true significance. These weren't just building plans. They were a roadmap, a guide for how to reclaim a life that had been set aside too long. My phone rang. Richard Morrison. "Emma, I've been thinking about our conversation. I'd like to propose something. Come into the office Monday morning. Bring your mother's drawings. Let's present this to the whole team, start building out a proper development plan. If we're going to do this, we should do it right." "I'll be there," I said. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and created a new folder. Morrison Project. I started uploading photos of my mother's notebooks, organizing the research I'd need. This was real now. Not just an abstract inheritance, but an actual project with timelines and budgets and 1,000 decisions that would need to be made. I thought about Gerald's words at the community meeting. "Don't try. Do. This neighborhood doesn't need another person who tries." I pulled up a blank document and started writing. Project timeline, key milestones, critical path items. I worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and determination, building the framework for how I'd turn my mother's vision into reality. At some point, I fell asleep at my desk, the drawings surrounding me, my mother's words from her letter echoing in my mind. "Build this for me. Build it for yourself. Build it for everyone who needs to see that there's another way." When I woke up just after dawn, the first thing I saw was the photograph I'd taken of the Morrison buildings. In the early light, they looked less abandoned and more patient, just waiting for someone to see their potential, to believe they could become something meaningful. I picked up my phone and texted Daniel Pierce. "When can we finalize the property purchase? I want to move forward." His response came within minutes. "I'll have the documents ready by end of week. Your mother would be proud, Emma." I hoped he was right. I hoped that wherever my mother was, she could see that her faith hadn't been misplaced, that the dreams she'd deferred weren't destroyed, just dormant, that sometimes the best inheritance isn't money or property or things. Sometimes it's the courage to live differently, to value what matters over what's expected. Sometimes it's the permission to finish what someone else started. and in doing so discover who you were always meant to be. The Morrison architecture team filled the conference room Monday morning, 12 people ranging from junior designers to senior project managers. Richard had assembled everyone who might touch the project in some capacity, and the energy in the room felt charged with anticipation. I'd arrived early to set up, spreading my mother's drawings across the large presentation table, arranging them in chronological order so people could see how the vision had evolved. Richard opened the meeting with brief introductions, then turned the floor over to me. I felt a flutter of nerves as I stood, but then I looked down at my mother's drawings and the anxiety steadied into purpose. My mother spent 15 years designing a development project that nobody knew about. I began. She did it in secret, late at night, stolen hours between family obligations and social commitments. She did it because she believed architecture could serve a higher purpose than just generating returns for investors. And before she died, she set up a trust to make sure this project actually got built. I walked them through the drawings, explaining the layout of the Morrison complex, the mix of affordable housing and market-rate units, the community center and artist studios, the public spaces designed to bring people together. I showed them my mother's research notes, her conversations with neighborhood residents, her careful attention to what the community actually needed, rather than what a developer might want to impose. This isn't just about buildings, I said. It's about proving something. That you can develop property responsibly. That profit doesn't have to be the only measure of success. That architecture can honor both the people who will live in a space and the community that surrounds it. The room was quiet when I finished. Then Sarah Chun, one of the senior designers, spoke up. The landmark status on those buildings is going to complicate everything. The Historical Society will want to preserve significant features, which limits what we can do structurally. I know, I acknowledged. But my mother saw that as an opportunity, not a constraint. The existing brickwork is beautiful. The bones of those buildings have character that new construction can't replicate. We work with what's there, not against it. Marcus Williams, the lead project manager, pulled up a map on his laptop. The site has river access, which is rare for downtown properties. But it also means we're dealing with floodplain regulations, environmental impact assessments, probably some contamination cleanup from the old shipping operations. The permitting alone could take 18 months. Then we start the permitting process immediately, I said. My mother's trust is structured to support a 3-year timeline. We use the first year for design development and approvals, break ground in year 2, complete construction by year 3. That's aggressive, Marcus said, but he was smiling. But doable if we're smart about sequencing. We spent the next 3 hours diving into details. Richard's team brought expertise I didn't have, raising issues I hadn't considered, offering solutions drawn from decades of combined experience. By the time we broke for lunch, we had the outline of a real plan. Not just wishful thinking, but a structured approach with clear phases and realistic milestones. Richard pulled me aside as people filtered out of the conference room. This is going to work, Emma. Your mother designed something genuinely innovative. We've done plenty of mixed-use projects, but nothing quite like this. The community engagement component, the affordability requirements, the focus on local businesses, it all ties together into something coherent. Something that could actually become a model for how urban development should happen. There's still so much that could go wrong, I said. Of course there is. Every project has risks. But you're not doing this alone. You've got a team now, people who know how to navigate the complications. Let us handle the technical challenges. You focus on protecting the vision, making sure we stay true to what your mother intended. I spent the afternoon in individual meetings with different team members, going deeper into specific aspects of the project. Sarah showed me examples of how other developments had integrated historic preservation with modern needs. Marcus walked me through the city's approval process, identifying which departments we'd need to work with, and who the key decision-makers were. Elena Rodriguez, the structural engineer, did a preliminary assessment of my mother's drawings and flagged areas where we'd need to do more detailed investigation of the existing buildings. By the time I left the office that evening, my notebook was filled with action items and my head was spinning with information. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope mixed with purpose. The project was taking shape, moving from abstract possibility to concrete reality. I stopped by the Morrison site on my way home, parking across the street just as the sun was setting. A few people were out walking dogs or jogging along the riverfront path that ran near the property. I watched them, imagining this view in 2 years. Lights in the windows, people coming and going. The sound of life filling spaces that had been empty for too long. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This is Patricia Chun from the Neighborhood Association. Are you free for coffee tomorrow? I'd like to talk about the community advisory board you mentioned. I texted back immediately. Yes. What time works for you? We arranged to meet at a cafe near her community center. I drove home feeling the momentum building, pieces clicking into place. My mother had set things up carefully, but now it was my job to execute, to turn her planning into action. That night I couldn't sleep again. Not from anxiety this time, but from ideas. I kept thinking about the community center space in my mother's drawings, about what programming might work there, about how to create something genuinely useful rather than just performatively inclusive. I got up and started making lists. Youth programs, adult education classes, meeting spaces for local organizations, maybe a small business incubator for neighborhood entrepreneurs. Tuesday morning arrived foggy and cool, typical Portland weather for November. I met Patricia at the cafe she'd suggested, a locally owned place that served excellent coffee and employed people with barriers to traditional work. She was already there when I arrived, 2 cups on the table. I got you an Americano, she said. Hope that's okay. You seem like an Americano person. I smiled. Good guess. We settled into chairs by the window. Patricia was probably in her 50s, with gray streaks in her dark hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't waste time on nonsense. I've been thinking about your offer, she began. The Community Advisory Board. It's a good idea, but only if you're serious about it. I've seen too many developers create advisory boards as window dressing, something they can point to when people complain, but that has no real power. If we're doing this, I need to know you'll actually listen. I will, I said. But more than that, I want to structure it so you have actual authority. Veto power over major decisions that affect the community. Written into the agreement. Patricia's eyebrows went up. That's unusual. My mother believed you can't serve a community without including them in real decision-making. I want to honor that principle, not just pay lip service to it. Your mother was at our meetings for almost 2 years, Patricia said. She never talked much, mostly just listened. But when she did speak up, it was always thoughtful. She asked questions that made us think harder about what we were assuming. One time we were complaining about a new apartment building going up, how it was going to bring in people who didn't understand the neighborhood. Your mother asked us what we were doing to welcome newcomers, to help them become part of the community instead of treating them like invaders. It shifted the whole conversation. I felt a pang of grief mixed with pride. That sounded exactly like my mother. Finding the question that reframed everything. I want to do this right, I told Patricia. But I'm going to need help. I'm an architect, not a community organizer. I understand buildings, not the social dynamics that make a neighborhood work. Then let's build that advisory board, Patricia said. I can recruit people. We'll want different voices, different perspectives. Longtime residents and newcomers. Homeowners and renters. Business owners. Maybe some representatives from the unhoused community too, since they use that riverfront area. We spent an hour mapping out what the advisory board might look like, how often it would meet, what kinds of decisions would require their input. Patricia was practical and experienced, understanding both what was ideal and what was realistic. By the end of our conversation, we had a framework that felt workable. One more thing, Patricia said as we were wrapping up. Gerald, the man who challenged you at the meeting last week, he's actually a retired architect. Worked for the city for 30 years before his pension kicked in. He knows every code and regulation, every trick developers use to get around requirements. You should talk to him. He could be valuable. I made a note of Gerald's contact information. The advisory board was starting to take shape, real people with real expertise who could help keep the project honest. The next few weeks blurred together in a cascade of meetings and decisions. The property purchase finalized, transferring the Morrison complex into the trust's ownership. I signed documents until my hand cramped, each signature another commitment to seeing this through. Richard's team completed their initial site assessment. The news was mixed. The buildings were structurally sound overall, better than we'd hoped given 20 years of neglect. But there was significant water damage in some areas, outdated electrical systems throughout, and yes, some soil contamination from the old shipping operations. The environmental cleanup alone would cost nearly $500,000. It's manageable, Marcus assured me, going over the numbers. We factored in contingencies for exactly these kinds of issues. The $8 million your mother allocated should cover everything, including the cleanup. We submitted our preliminary applications to the city's planning department, starting the long process of approvals and permits. Sarah refined my mother's drawings into professional architectural renderings, maintaining the spirit of the original designs while updating them to current building codes. The results were stunning. In the renderings, the Morrison buildings came alive, glass and brick working together, green spaces integrated throughout, people of all ages and backgrounds inhabiting the spaces. I showed the renderings at the next neighborhood association meeting, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. Even Gerald, the skeptical retired architect, nodded approvingly. Your mother knew what she was doing, he said afterward, studying the technical drawings. These are solid designs. Thoughtful. You can see she wasn't just trying to maximize square footage. She was thinking about flow, about how people would actually use these spaces. Would you be willing to join the advisory board? I asked. Patricia mentioned you worked for the city. We could use someone who understands the regulatory side. Gerald looked surprised, then pleased. I'd be honored. Your mother would have asked the same thing, I think. She understood the value of different kinds of expertise. The advisory board held its first official meeting in December, gathering in Patricia's community center on a rainy evening. 8 people showed up, representing different aspects of the neighborhood. Gerald was there, along with Keisha, the young woman who'd questioned my motives at the first meeting. There was also Marcus Thompson, who owned a small construction company and employed local workers. Elena Vasquez, who ran a nonprofit serving immigrant families. James Park, a longtime resident who'd watched the neighborhood change over decades. Maria Santos, a street outreach worker who knew the unhoused population. And 2 younger residents, David Chun and Alicia Brown, who'd moved to the area within the past 5 years. I presented the updated plans, walking through each component of the development. When I finished, I opened the floor for questions and concerns. The conversation that followed was exactly what I'd hoped for. Detailed, challenging, constructive. Keisha pushed back on the affordable housing percentages, arguing they should be higher. Gerald questioned some of the structural approaches, suggesting alternatives that might be more cost-effective. Elena asked about language accessibility and cultural considerations in the community center programming. James worried about construction impacts on existing residents. Every concern was legitimate. Every question pushed me to think harder about decisions I'd been making. This was what real community engagement looked like, messy and time-consuming and absolutely essential. I'm hearing a lot about affordability, I said after we'd been talking for an hour. And I agree the 40% target my mother set might not be enough. But here's the reality. I'm working with a fixed budget. Every dollar that goes to increasing affordability is a dollar that can't go somewhere else. So let's talk about trade-offs. What would you be willing to give up to increase the affordable housing percentage? The question sparked intense debate. Some people felt the commercial space allocation should be reduced. Others argued the community center could be smaller. A few suggested we should just find more funding somehow. But gradually, through discussion and compromise, we landed on a modified plan. 45% affordable housing, achieved by reducing some of the market rate unit sizes and scaling back certain amenities in the community center. I can work with that, I said. I'll have our team revise the plans and run the numbers. If it pencils out financially, we'll make the change. Maria, the outreach worker, raised a different concern. What about the people who are currently using that property? There's usually 5 or 6 folks sleeping rough in those buildings. Where are they supposed to go during construction? It was a question I should have anticipated but hadn't. I made a note, promising to research options. I don't want this project to just displace problems. If people are using those buildings for shelter now, we need to help them find alternatives before we start demolition. The meeting ran late, well past the planned end time. When we finally wrapped up, I was exhausted but energized. This was what my mother had envisioned, development as a collaborative process rather than a top-down imposition. Patricia pulled me aside as people were leaving. "You did good tonight. You listened, you took notes, you didn't get defensive when people challenged you. That's rare. Most developers, they hold these meetings just to check a box. You're actually trying to incorporate feedback. It makes the project better," I said simply. "Why wouldn't I want input from people who know the neighborhood better than I do?" Christmas came and went quietly. I spent the day alone in my apartment, working on revisions to the project plans. Victoria had invited me to Riverside Manor for dinner, but I declined. Being in that house, watching her play hostess in our mother's space, would have been too much. Instead, I video called Grace, who'd retired to a small house on the Oregon coast. She asked about the project, and I spent an hour showing her updated renderings and telling her about the advisory board meetings. "Catherine would be so proud," Grace said, her eyes bright with emotion. "She always believed you understood what mattered." She was right. By January, we'd completed the design development phase. The plans had been refined based on advisory board feedback and technical requirements from the city. The affordable housing percentage had increased to 45% as promised. We'd secured commitments from 3 local businesses interested in the commercial spaces, including a small grocery store that would serve the neighborhood's food access needs. The community center programming had been developed in partnership with local organizations who would actually run the programs. The city planning department scheduled our main approval hearing for late February. This would be the big test, presenting the project to the Planning Commission and addressing any concerns from other city departments or members of the public. I spent weeks preparing for the hearing, working with Richard's team to anticipate questions and develop responses. We put together a comprehensive presentation showing not just what we wanted to build, but why it mattered, how it would benefit the community, and how we'd addressed all the technical requirements. The hearing was held in City Hall, in a large room set up with rows of chairs facing a raised dais where the planning commissioners sat. I arrived early with Richard and several team members, setting up our presentation materials and trying to calm my nerves. The room filled gradually. Members of the advisory board showed up, showing their support. I saw Gerald and Patricia and Keisha, along with several others. But there were also people I didn't recognize, some carrying signs that read, "Stop Gentrification," and "Neighborhood Not for Sale." My stomach dropped. Protesters. Richard noticed my expression and leaned over. "This is normal. Any significant development gets opposition. Just stick to the presentation. Let the facts speak for themselves." The hearing began with routine business, other projects, and minor zoning changes. Finally, around 40 minutes in, our project was called. I walked to the podium, acutely aware of everyone watching. I started with my mother's story, how she'd been an architect before giving up her career to support my father's business, how she'd never stopped dreaming about the buildings she might have created, how she'd spent 15 years secretly designing this project, planning every detail, engaging with the community, creating something that would outlive her. "This isn't just a real estate development," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's a vision for how cities can grow without losing their soul. How we can create new housing without displacing existing residents. How architecture can serve everyone, not just people who can afford market-rate prices." I walked through the plans, highlighting the affordability commitments, the community center, the local business focus, the environmental sustainability features. I talked about the advisory board and how community input had shaped every aspect of the design. I showed letters of support from neighborhood organizations and local businesses. When I finished, the commissioners asked questions. Technical things mostly about parking ratios and traffic impacts and how we'd phase construction. I deferred to Marcus and Sarah for some answers, grateful to have their expertise backing me up. Then the public comment period began. Several members of the advisory board spoke in support. Patricia gave an impassioned statement about how rare it was to see a developer genuinely engage with community needs. Gerald, the retired architect, vouched for the technical quality of the designs. But then the opponents got their turn. A woman stood up, identifying herself as a representative of a neighborhood preservation group. "This project will accelerate gentrification," she argued. "Even with affordable housing, It will change the character of the area, drive up surrounding property values, and ultimately displace longtime residents. We've seen this pattern before. Well-meaning developments that end up doing more harm than good. Others echoed similar concerns. The project was too big, too ambitious. It would bring too much change too quickly. Better to leave the buildings empty than to risk the consequences of development. I listened to each speaker, taking notes, trying to understand their perspective. When the public comment period ended, the commission chair asked if I wanted to respond. I returned to the podium, choosing my words carefully. I hear the concerns about gentrification. They're valid. Development does change neighborhoods and not always for the better. But here's what I'd ask you to consider. Those buildings have been empty for 20 years. That's 20 years of blight, of wasted potential, of a valuable site contributing nothing to the community. Leaving them empty isn't a neutral choice. It's a choice to accept decline. I paused, making eye contact with the commissioners. My mother designed this project to prove that development doesn't have to be destructive, that you can build new housing while protecting affordability, that you can welcome change while honoring what exists. Will this project be perfect? No. Will some people be unhappy with any change? Probably. But the alternative, continuing to do nothing, that's not an option either. Cities have to grow. The question is whether that growth will be thoughtful and inclusive, or whether it will just serve whoever has the most money. The commission deliberated for 20 minutes, discussing among themselves while we waited. Finally, the chair called for a vote. One by one, the commissioners indicated their decision. It passed. 7-2 with conditions about phasing and ongoing community engagement, but it passed. I felt Richard's hand on my shoulder as relief washed through me. We'd cleared the biggest regulatory hurdle. The project was approved. Outside City Hall, the advisory board members gathered around, offering congratulations. Patricia hugged me, something I hadn't expected. Your mother would have been in that room if she could have been, she said. But I think she knew you'd be able to speak for her vision. And you did. The protesters had disappeared, moving on to their next cause. I felt a twinge of sympathy for them. They weren't wrong about the risks of development. They just reached a different conclusion about whether those risks were worth taking. Over the next few months, the project shifted from planning to preparation. We finalized contracts with builders and suppliers. We secured the necessary insurance and bonding. We hired a community liaison, someone who would maintain contact with neighbors throughout construction and address concerns as they arose. In April, Maria, the street outreach worker, connected me with the people who'd been sheltering in the Morrison buildings. With her help, we found each of them alternative housing or shelter placements before we took possession of the site. It wasn't perfect, the shelter system was inadequate, but at least we weren't literally pushing people out onto the streets. The groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for May, time to coincide with my mother's birthday. The advisory board helped plan the event, making sure it felt like a community celebration rather than a corporate photo opportunity. The morning of the groundbreaking arrived sunny and warm, perfect spring weather. We'd set up a small stage near the Morrison buildings, with chairs arranged in rows for guests. I'd invited everyone who'd been part of the journey, from Richard's team to the advisory board to city officials who'd supported the project. Victoria showed up, which surprised me. I hadn't invited her specifically, but news of the groundbreaking had appeared in the local paper. She stood at the back of the crowd, dressed impeccably as always, her expression unreadable. Patricia opened the ceremony, welcoming everyone and talking about what the project meant for the neighborhood. Gerald spoke about my mother's careful planning and attention to detail. Richard discussed the architectural significance of preserving the historic buildings while adapting them for modern use. Then it was my turn. I stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of people who'd made this possible, and beyond them to the Morrison buildings waiting to be transformed. A year ago, I sat in a lawyer's office and learned that my mother had left me nothing. I began. Or that's what I thought. The will gave everything to my sister. The company, the houses, the investments. I got personal items, jewelry and books and art supplies. I saw Victoria shift uncomfortably in the back row. But then I learned about a second inheritance. Not money, though there was that too. Not property, though we're standing on it now. What my mother really left me was permission. Permission to dream big. Permission to believe that architecture could be about more than maximizing returns. Permission to try something difficult because it was worth doing, not because it was easy. I pulled out my mother's college journal, the one where she'd written about giving up her architectural dreams. My mother spent 30 years convinced she'd made the practical choice, the mature decision. But the truth is, deferred dreams don't disappear. They just wait. And if we're lucky, we get a second chance. Sometimes through our own efforts. Sometimes through someone we loved enough to carry our vision forward. I talked about the project, about the community engagement process, about the year of planning and designing and fighting for approval. I talked about what these buildings would become, spaces where people could afford to live and work, where community could flourish, where architecture served human needs rather than just investor returns. My mother called this her legacy project, I concluded. But I think it's more than that. It's proof that it's never too late to reclaim what you thought you'd lost. That dreams deferred aren't dreams destroyed. That the choices we make, even the compromises, don't have to define us forever. We can still build something meaningful. We can still create something that matters. The applause started small, then built into something sustained and genuine. I saw people in the crowd wiping their eyes, moved by the story or by their own delayed dreams. I couldn't be sure which. After the ceremony, I worked my way through the crowd, thanking people for coming, accepting congratulations. When I finally reached Victoria, she was standing alone, her expression complex. "That was quite a speech," she said. "Very moving. I had no idea Mom left you all this." She set it up separately. It wasn't part of the main estate. Clearly. Victoria looked at the Morrison buildings, really seeing them perhaps for the first time. $8 million. That's not nothing. No, it's not. Why didn't you tell me? When we met at the attorney's office, you let me think you'd gotten nothing but trinkets. I considered how to answer. Because this needed to be separate. Mom set it up that way deliberately. The trust has conditions. I can't accept help from Hayes Development. If I'd told you immediately, you would have wanted to get involved, wanted to make it a family project. And then I would have had to refuse, and things between us would have gotten even worse. Victoria was quiet for a moment. You're probably right. I would have tried to help. Would have seen it as an opportunity to prove I'm not just about profit margins, that I can appreciate community development too. Are you angry? I asked. No. Maybe a little hurt that Mom didn't trust me with this. But mostly I'm impressed. This is ambitious, Emma. Way more ambitious than anything you've done before. You've always been talented, but I didn't think you had this in you. The leadership, the vision, the ability to navigate politics and community dynamics. I underestimated you. It was perhaps the most genuine thing Victoria had said to me in years. Thank you. That means something. Are you going to be okay financially? While this project is underway. Because if you need help, the trust provides a stipend. I'll be fine. She nodded, accepting the boundary. Well, good luck with the construction phase. I mean that sincerely. I hope this becomes everything Mom wanted it to be. Victoria left shortly after, and I was glad she'd come. Not because we'd suddenly become close, but because she'd witnessed this moment, seen what our mother had really valued and who she'd trusted to execute that vision. There was a kind of closure in that. Construction began in June. The first phase involved environmental cleanup and stabilization of the existing structures. I visited the site almost daily, watching as crews carefully dismantled damaged sections while preserving the architectural features worth saving. The historic brick facades, the old-growth timber beams, the industrial windows that had once looked out on a working waterfront. The advisory board continued to meet monthly, reviewing progress and addressing issues as they arose. There were challenges inevitable in any project this complex. Costs ran higher than expected in some areas, requiring adjustments in other parts of the budget. The timeline slipped by a few weeks when we discovered additional structural issues in one building. Neighbors complained about construction noise and dust. But we worked through each problem methodically, staying focused on the ultimate goal. By the end of the first year of construction, the buildings had been stabilized and partially renovated. You could start to see what they would become, the blend of historic character and modern functionality. In September, Richard called me into his office. "I want to show you something," he said, pulling up an article on his computer. It was from a national architecture magazine, a piece about innovative urban development projects. The Morrison Complex was featured prominently, highlighted as an example of how cities could address housing affordability without sacrificing design quality or community character. "We're getting attention," Richard said. "Good attention. I've had 3 inquiries this week from other cities asking if we'd consider similar projects in their communities. This is becoming a model, Emma. Just like your mother hoped." The article included renderings of the project and quotes from advisory board members. Patricia was quoted saying, "This is the first development I've seen that actually lived up to its community engagement promises." Gerald said, "Catherine Hayes designed something truly special. Her daughter is making sure it gets built right." I read the article twice, feeling a mix of pride and responsibility. People were watching now, seeing whether this approach could really work. The pressure to succeed felt heavier than ever. By the project's second year, construction was in full swing. The residential units were taking shape, the commercial spaces being fitted out, the community center rising from what had been a deteriorating warehouse. I split my time between the office where I reviewed plans and coordinated with contractors, and the site where I could see the progress firsthand. Grace visited in the spring, making the drive from the coast to see the project. We walked through the buildings together, and I showed her how my mother's drawings were being translated into reality. The careful placement of windows to maximize natural light, the communal spaces designed to encourage interaction, the attention to accessibility and sustainability. "She would have loved this," Grace said, running her hand along a restored brick wall. "Not just the buildings themselves but the process. The way you've brought people along, made them part of creating something. That's what Catherine always believed architecture should be. Collaborative, not dictatorial." In the final months before completion, the focus shifted to details. Selecting finishes, coordinating move-in schedules, finalizing the community center programming. The advisory board helped review applications for the affordable housing units, ensuring the selection process was fair and transparent. We held a community open house in October, inviting neighborhood residents to tour the nearly completed buildings. Hundreds of people showed up, walking through units, asking questions, imagining themselves in these spaces. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, though a few people still expressed concerns about change. The official opening was scheduled for November, almost exactly 3 years after my mother's funeral. We planned a weekend-long celebration, with tours, performances, and community gatherings in the new spaces. The night before the opening, I stood alone in the community center, a large open space with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the river. The room was set up for tomorrow's ceremony, chairs arranged in neat rows, a podium positioned for speakers. But for this moment it was just me and the space my mother had imagined. I pulled out my phone and opened the photo of her I kept there, taken in the conservatory at Riverside Manor. She was smiling, relaxed, caught in a moment of genuine happiness. I wished she could be here, could see what her vision had become. My phone rang, interrupting the moment. "Daniel Pierce." "Emma, I wanted to call before tomorrow's ceremony. I've been reviewing the trust documents, doing the final accounting now that the project is complete. You came in under budget by about $200,000. "Really? I thought we'd spent everything." "Your team was efficient. And you made some smart choices about where to spend and where to save. According to the trust terms, any surplus funds revert to you personally. It's not a fortune, but it's a decent amount. $200,000. Enough to serve as a financial cushion, seed money for whatever came next. My mother, even in death, still taking care of me." "There's something else," Daniel continued. "I got a call today from Victoria. She wanted to know if there were any other trusts or hidden inheritances she should know about. I told her no, that everything has been disclosed. But I got the sense she's been thinking about what your mother did, how she structured things. I think it bothered her more than she let on." "She came to the groundbreaking," I said. "Told me she was impressed with what I'd done. I think she finally understood that Mom wasn't just thinking about business qualifications. She was thinking about values, about who would honor her real priorities." "Catherine was very deliberate about all of this," Daniel agreed. "She knew exactly what she was doing, who she was rewarding, and why. I think she also hoped that seeing you succeed with this project might change how Victoria thinks about development, about what's possible when profit isn't the only goal. After we hung up, I sat in one of the community center chairs, looking around at what we'd created. This room would host after-school programs and adult education classes. It would be a place for neighborhood meetings and community celebrations. It would serve people, not just generate returns for investors. The opening ceremony drew a crowd that exceeded our expectations. City officials, neighborhood residents, members of the press, and architecture professionals, all gathering to celebrate not just a completed building but a proven concept. Patricia opened the program, talking about the 3-year journey from abandoned warehouses to thriving community space. Gerald spoke about the technical achievement of preserving historic structures while meeting modern building standards. Richard discussed the architectural significance and the interest the project was generating nationally. Then I took the podium for my final speech. I talked about my mother, about the dreams she deferred and the legacy she'd planned. I thanked everyone who'd been part of making this real, from the advisory board to the construction workers to the city officials who believed in the vision. 3 years ago, I thought my inheritance was books and jewelry, I said. I was wrong. My real inheritance was the permission to believe that architecture matters, that spaces shape lives, that we can build communities that work for everyone. My mother gave me that. And now together, we've proven it's possible. I looked out at the crowd, seeing so many people who'd contributed to this success. And in the back, standing quietly, I saw Victoria. She met my eyes and nodded, a gesture of respect that felt like its own kind of closure. After the ceremony, people toured the buildings, exploring the residential units and commercial spaces, imagining the life that would soon fill these halls. I watched them move through the spaces my mother had designed, and I felt her presence in every carefully considered detail. As the day wound down and the crowd dispersed, I found myself back in the community center, exhausted but satisfied. The space was empty now except for a few people cleaning up. I walked to the windows looking out at the river, watching the water flow past, constant and changing at once. My phone buzzed. A text from Grace. Catherine would be so incredibly proud. You took her vision and made it better than she imagined. That's the best kind of inheritance. I stood there as the evening light faded, thinking about inheritance and legacy, about what we carry forward and what we transform. My mother had given me resources and a vision, but what I'd built was my own. Her dreams filtered through my skills, her values expressed through my choices. The Morrison project was complete. The buildings were full of life and possibility. The community had a new space to gather and grow. And I had proved to myself and to everyone watching that architecture could be about more than profit. That development could serve communities instead of exploiting them. That dreams deferred could still be realized, even if the dreamer wasn't there to see them finished. I thought about Victoria at Riverside Manor, running Hayes Development the way our father had, maximizing returns and quarterly results. She'd inherit his legacy, continue his work. That was her path and I didn't judge it. But I'd inherited something different. Not just money or property, but a way of thinking about what mattered. A belief that success could be measured in lives improved rather than just dollars earned. A commitment to building things that would outlast us and serve purposes larger than ourselves. As I left the community center that evening, locking the door behind me, I carried with me the knowledge that I'd honored my mother's faith in me. I'd taken her carefully laid plans and executed them. I'd navigated the challenges and stayed true to the vision. I'd proved that the young woman who'd wanted to change the world with buildings wasn't naive. She'd just been early. And now, standing at the beginning of whatever came next, I understood that this was just the start. The Morrison project would become a model, inspiring similar developments in other cities. Richard had already received inquiries about consulting on comparable projects. My career was no longer about being an associate at someone else's firm. It was about leading transformational work that proved architecture could change lives. I walked to my car as the city lights came on around me, Portland glowing in the autumn darkness. Tomorrow I'd start thinking about next steps, about where this path would lead. But tonight, I let myself simply feel the satisfaction of completion, of promises kept, of faith justified. My mother had given me more than an inheritance. She'd given me a purpose. And I'd given her vision wings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.